Well, hello, I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Welcome to this end-of-season wrap-up for Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. We've now completed 3 seasons of the pod, and in Season 3 we welcome the usual potpourri of guests from the worlds of copywriting, diversity and inclusion, forensic science, market research, digital marketing and business efficiency. You know, the more people I speak to on Data Malarkey, the more the planets align and the easier it is to join the dots between radically different professions. This season's guests may, at first, second and 34th glance, appear to have very little in common. And yet talk to them about the challenges they face with data, in getting hold of relevant data in the first place, then cleansing it and filling in the gaps, and the more commonalities we identify across the modern knowledge economy. One area where there are, not surprisingly, considerable differences is in the types of data our guests work with. Sabrina Shadie is an award-winning diversity, ethics and inclusion problem solver, the founder of the pioneering D'Rose Consultancy. She gave us her distinctive perspective on both the classes of data she works with, how she gets hold of them, and the particular issues of ownership of data in her field.
So we use a lot of research that's out in the world, particularly around how protected characteristics, which are the 9 elements identified in the Equality Act, have an impact, usually detrimentally, for people trying to make their way in the world. So, you know, somebody who, like myself, for example, you know, I've got ADHD, I'm a black woman, you know, UK-born black woman. How does those 2 things interact with my ability to achieve in a particular outcome, you know, whether it's your career or your education or your health, and all of those different elements have an impact in your ability to be employed and it's understanding those nuances and how they impact us as an organization. So if I'm running a charity and I want to be, you know, I want to support my staff to be more inclusive, I want to make sure we're meeting our diversity goals and targets. I don't like quotas. I don't think they work. I think they're very tokenistic. But in terms of how do we support the people we already have and how do we engage the people who we're maybe missing, we can look at that data. We can go, okay, where's your baseline? Who have you got in your organization now? How does that reflect the demographic where you work? You know, whether that's your location or the type of people you're trying to engage. If you're a mental health charity, what's the demographic that you're trying to achieve and where are you right now? The data allows us to see what the baseline is, but the data also allows us to project then where we want to get to, and the existing research allows us to determine what the steps are. So we use data in lots of ways, and we analyze it in ways, and we have quite a few people sort of say, "Oh well, if you just gather the data, we'll take it back in house and we'll analyze it ourselves," and it doesn't quite work like that, because without that understanding of the diversity lens, you're not going to get that different outcome. You're not going to get a different understanding, because if you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always got. And I think that's part of the issue with talking about diversity, is we're like, oh, okay, so we've got all this new information now, but we're going to keep doing everything exactly the way we've always done it. I'm wondering why we're not getting better outcomes. And that's why, yeah, the diversity space is a really interesting one, because there's so much that's always been the case. We've always known, but we've never done, and it's about the doing. So it's using the data to take the action.
The world of forensics pulls often fragmentary evidence from diverse sources, from microscopic fragments of clothing to chemical traces, from CCTV footage to DNA. The forensic scientist of her generation, Professor Angela Gallop, explains more.
Can you describe what kinds of data that you've used in your career to solve crimes, and perhaps how this has changed over the course of your career? I'm thinking particularly about the growing importance of both DNA and digital evidence.
Well, I mean, as a forensic biologist, which is where I started, I've always been very interested in blood and other body fluids, and not just identifying them and sort of categorizing them, trying to find out who they could and couldn't have come from, but also looking at the patterns that they form, because they can be amazingly helpful at crime scenes or bloodstains on or potential offenders' clothing and so on. And so patterns are critical. And then weapons and damage to clothing, damage to all sorts of things, but certainly that, and then sort of connected with that. And because we are dealing mainly with crimes, what we used to be called offences against the person. So, crimes where people get hurt, basically, and people wear clothing. And so when they've been in contact with each other, beating each other up or whatever it might have been, then their clothing comes into contact. And so it's looking for the transfer of the tiny fragments of textile fibres that break off as you wear your clothing, and then are available for transfer from the surface of one item of clothing to another if there's contact between two people wearing them. And then more broadly, of course, I mean, once you extend it out into, what other people in the laboratory do, because there are lots of expertise and skills applied to forensics. There's the toxicologists, there are people who deal with drugs of abuse, there are the chemists who deal with marks of all kinds, fingerprints, but footwear marks and manufacturing marks, tool marks when people jemmy open windows, all that sort of thing, and tiny chemical traces like sort of paint and glass and a whole host of other things. And then fires and firearms and explosions and question documents if someone's questioning a will or, some signature on something or, whatever it might be. There's all of that. And now, of course, as you say, we have all these digital traces that we're able to use as, or look for forensic traces, forensic evidence that someone's, been in contact with someone and where they were when it happened and all the rest of it. So really powerful digital evidence if you get to it quickly enough. And CCTV, of course, is really critical too. But I think, I think there have been advances, it has changed a lot since I joined the Forensic Science Service in 1974. We were grouping blood and body fluids then. Now we have DNA, which is just, I can't tell you, it must be the biggest thing in forensic science, I think, because now instead of being rather pleased when we've got a bunch of groups that enable us to say, oh, well, this blood could have come from one in a few thousand people if we're lucky. Now, if we get a full DNA profile, we say it's come in, it's 1 in a billion. I mean, it's just, orders of magnitude different. So extremely powerful. And we have DNA databases now that we can use. National DNA databases, incredibly handy. So we have all of that going on. But I mean, there have been advances across the board. I mean, there are more powerful instruments these days, so we can analyze smaller traces of things. We can identify them very quickly. We've got built-in libraries in our machines. We can batch samples and run them overnight, so things are quicker and cheaper than they used to be for the police. So there have been advances right across, as you would expect, right across the spectrum of different sorts of tests that forensic scientists apply. But the other thing that's happened as well, and I think particularly when we got into being able to do cold cases in the way that we do them now, and largely through DNA, but through other things as well. But there have also been huge developments in the approaches that are taken to investigating old cases. We've learned an enormous amount about, what's a good thing to do and what's a bad thing to do, and what's necessary, what's unnecessary. And all the issues around, if you've got a very old case, being very careful that what you find now is the result of some sort of contamination over the years. So we've got very skilled at that. So lots of developments in understanding and devising better ways of investigating cases with the tools that we have than simply just the technology itself.
Political pollster Andrew Cooper founded Populous, which has recently morphed into Yonder Consulting. Andrew, now Lord Cooper of Windrush, ennobled for his time as Cameron's Director of Strategy in Number 10, told me how his team have layered multiple data sources, from the census, political analysis and polling, to build a model that explains how Brexit broke the structure of British politics.
We were then able to map psychological archetypes on top of voting behaviour. And suddenly you're starting to build up this kind of this textured, layered understanding and see the interrelationship of things. And then we go to 2016 and the EU referendum, and we did the same exercise, and we had a bit more modelling because the EU referendum was counted at local authority level, not parliamentary constituencies. So we had to model from authorities into constituencies for comparability. But what we then found was that the Brexit referendum when you map it in that way onto the census demographics, the kind of fault line is on a different plane. So rather than being dominated by an axis where you've got the Conservatives high in security, low in diversity, Labour high in diversity, low in security, the Leave vote is heavily concentrated in the bits of Britain that are defined by being low in security and low in diversity, and Remain dominates in the bits of Britain that are both high in diversity and high in security. And what that means is that the kind of battle line, the kind of marginal seats, as it were, of that referendum, that line cuts right through the heartland of both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. So half of the Conservative heartland, the bit which is more diverse as well as well off, voted to Remain, and half of Labour's heartland, the bits of Labour heartland which is quite non-diverse as well as being less well off, voted to Leave. And so this analysis, this demographic analysis, this way of modelling census data and overlaying polling data, we felt literally in sort of one very clear chart told an incredibly powerful story of how Brexit basically broke the structure of British politics.
And Andrew and his team's smarts don't just explain the idiosyncrasies of Britain. The surge in populism and the growth of the far right in countries right around the globe is explained by the same model. And cross-country comparisons reveal the impact of the perceived failure of globalization for ordinary citizens worldwide.
It seemed as though the world had got too complex to understand, but you seem to be reining it in. Would you say you're reining it in?
I mean, it's a very good explanation. The other great thing about it, because it's built on census data, it's incredibly robust, and everybody can see that. But also because it's based on census data, any country that publishes its census data in a reasonably granular way, we can create an equivalent model. So we've created clock-face models for the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. So it's a powerful tool for countries operating in more than one market. It creates a kind of it captures the dynamics within each market, but in a way which is directly comparable with the other markets. And it's interesting that when we look at some of the macro trends that we observed in the UK from it, particularly the kind of political rotation that's happening, is basically happening everywhere. And essentially, the story which comes out is, I think, at its simplest, is that globalization, first the economic disruption and then the kind of cultural and social disruption that came from globalization, has caused a reaction in which, in every market, people who are defined demographically by being both relatively less well qualified in terms of education, relatively less well off, and living in less well connected, more rural, less diverse places, in every country, those people have been becoming more nationalistic in their outlook and seeking more populist solutions in their preferences. And that's had the effect of shifting the centre of gravity of the main centre-right party in each country and displacing other people. And what's really interesting, after we observed this, and I went back and I found an extraordinary speech that Tony Blair gave in 2006. So I think to some extent Brexit sort of brought some of these things to the surface, but what the model captures is actually that shift had already started to happen in the 1990s, and Brexit in a sense was a consequence of it, not a cause of it. And Tony Blair did a speech 10 years before the Brexit referendum, before it became much more visible, in which he said that the emerging fault line of politics was ceasing to be the economics of left and right and starting to be, in his terminology, open versus closed. And interestingly, when we mapped on that Cambridge University psychological profiling, in the sort of neutral language of psychology, closed lands bang in the middle of where Brexit was, the bits of Britain defined on our model by being both low in security and low in diversity, and open lands right in the heartland of where Remain is. So it does actually start to align with that, and I think so. It's people whose reactions to globalization were either respectively to have the impulse really kind of to want to shut out those big storms and changes, or alternatively to embrace them, really is the defining thing. And what we then find was when you map onto that some other macro attitudes. So, for example, on a very simple polling question of do you think that the following things are overall in the world a force for good or a force for ill, we find an incredibly close correlation between what people thought about Brexit and where they fall on that force for ill, force for good on things like globalization, multiculturalism, immigration, the green movement, feminism, a whole range of things, which actually cluster really tightly. And that tells us something else really important about the Brexit issue, which is that for most people on both sides, it wasn't really or just a question about what the UK's relationship should be with the European Union. That question was, whether people realised it or not, was actually a proxy for a much deeper set of kind of core values and a kind of world view. And I think that explains why it was so polarising and divisive, and why so few people changed their minds. So I thought we learned a lot from layering on the data in that way.
And from the ridiculous to the sublime, Emmy award-winning copywriter Les Gessing walked us through his heady mix of tabular data, linguistic data, text analysis, text mining, and both types of NLP, natural language processing and neuro-linguistic programming, to build a model of how jokes work.
What kind of data is the most important to you in your work, would you say?
No, and this is partly how I wound up in data. I've been very interested in language really for a long time. I mean, that's what brought me into this. And I studied hypnosis, which has to do with language, for about 20 years. And that led me into this. And so natural language processing, which is NLP, is about data. Though for a long time, I actually studied NLP, which is neuro-linguistic programming, which is about linguistics and about hypnosis and a lot of stuff like that. And that kind of led me to this. So I do also think tabular data is fantastic. I'm really big on, I believe copywriters and creatives should be brainstorming off of data, whether it's tabular data, Google Analytics 4 data, or mining text, which is something I'm super interested in.
That's really, really, really interesting. I mean, I've hung around in various corners of marketing, communications, content development for almost 35 years now. And I have to say that I feel that you are somewhat of an outlier when it comes to fusing creativity with data. There's this. I mean, you're an ideal guest for a podcast that's about using data smarter. But you know, for a long time, I don't know if this phrase ever crossed the pond, but for a long time, marketing was described as the colouring in department.
I haven't heard of it. Yeah, that's.
I think it's moved in many ways. It's moved a long way beyond that. But of course, for a lot of its time, you know, going back to John Wanamaker, the American department store owner, don't know which half my advertising spend is wasted. Well, I mean, we don't need to worry about that now because those bright econometricians are able to build the cause and effect models that tell us that actually this creative or that channel's working. But you've hinted that there was a project that got you into this 7 to 10 years ago. Why are you so such an enthusiast for data science, and AI? Where does that passion and that spark come from?
So I've always liked comedy and comedians, and I'm a wildly unsuccessful screenwriter. I wrote 9 screenplays. I sold squat. That's how come I moved to Los Angeles. I live in Michigan now. But I would freelance, and then I would write screenplays. It was a wonderful lifestyle. But one of the things I did in studying neuro-linguistic programming, that NLP, was the goal of that was to build models, mental models. And not sure they ever exactly achieved that. Their metaphor was kind of like the human brain as a computer. And that has its limits, but it was very helpful in making me think that way, you know? And so one of my best friends taught stand-up comedy. He was actually a graduate of Clown College. And we used to talk about building a model of comedy. And like, you know, it's interesting if you think about it, you know, you and I just, you know, don't know each other all that well. We're in the same room. We hear a joke. We both laugh. How is that possible? 30, 40, 50 people, everybody will laugh, or most of them will, because we recognize that there is some underlying algorithm to a type of joke. And you can sort of recognize that, but nobody has sort of formalized that. And in a way, you know, it's kind of like bad to analyze comedy in a way, because it just destroys it. So he and I used to talk about this, and then we've kind of gone our separate ways. But it was something that really intrigued me. And then one day I was working on a project, but I started to try to write out, okay, well, what is this? Is this thing I'm thinking about, right? And I started making little arrow kind of things, which are actually sort of vectors. And I was on the math team in the 7th or 8th grade, so I knew a little bit about math. But honestly, I recently took a test, and I tested at the 5th grade level in math. So I'm not a math wizard, but I remember distinctly because I was in a restaurant and I started drawing these things, and I thought, wow, that's math. I mean, these things are little algorithms. I didn't quite know what algorithm was, and I thought, wow, that's really interesting. That there are different things in different ways that you could mathematically summarize, right? And so I took a little while and I looked around the restaurant at that point because I was like, oh no, I'm not smart enough to think about this stuff. Literally, I was like a little like, oh no, am I going crazy? And then I started to explore it, and I wrote a book. I wrote it out handwritten, which I'm actually trying now to turn into text using digital stuff. But so I have about what might be considered like 80 algorithms, and I can sort of tell you one. I don't want to tell you the whole IP, but I can tell you how it works. But if you think about, like, Stephen Wright's a good person to do this because he'll have a joke. He has a joke structure. One of these algorithms is kind of applies it to itself. So if you think about, like, he has a joke. I used to work at a fire hydrant company. You can't park anywhere near the place, right? Cute joke, but you can sort of. But there's another joke, which is if you're writing with invisible ink, how do you know when you're out, right? And so those two jokes in a series of jokes have a lot of the same structure, and that is it takes a quality of that thing and applies it to itself. And then so there are about 80 different types of those. And then just like in machine learning, a lot of times what you get ultimately from a comedian is not a structure of a joke, but an ensemble of a joke. There's 4 or 5 of these things, so it makes it hard to kind of figure out. So I spent quite a bit of time writing all this up, and that's all I did for a few weeks. It was sort of this kind of crazy time in my life. And then I thought, well, can I write jokes from this? And you know what? I can. I used it to show that I could write jokes, but it is very left brain, right brain, and it breaks my brain to do it. It's hard to analyze. That's one of the things I'm good at is using the data, and data analysis is very logical with sort of creative stuff, right? And so I've had it around for a long time and not sure what to do with it, but it got me into thinking about, well, how can I make something out of this? How can I make an app out of this or something? And that got me into programming. Early on, I actually tried to steal a program from somebody. I didn't know how programs worked. I bought his software thinking the program would be there. I didn't program. So just slowly, I started doing more and more. I started learning to program in Python and R and SQL and some stuff like that. And that was super hard for me. I'm not a great programmer. But that led me into data science. And about the time that happened, data science was really kicking its heels up, I started to go into meetups. I went to UCLA for cinematography, and I shoot videos. So I would go shoot videos of these meetups. And I helped, not really found, but I was one of the initial members of Data Science Los Angeles. And that was maybe 10 years ago. And at the time, it was so early on in this revolution, probably about the time of ImageNet, that people, were basically reading their PhD thesis. That would be the meetup. It wasn't, and then it just exploded, and then there's more and more and more. So that's what kind of led me into it. And now, particularly with large language models and how attention works, I'm realizing, wow, okay, this will work for the kind of thing I've been carrying around in a notebook for about 20 years.
If we'd been podcasting a year ago, ChatGPT would have been available for about 3 weeks. It's remarkable how, with its rapid, widespread and sudden availability of the myriad tools resting on large language models, AI is such a talking point. And it's been a talking point throughout Season 3 of Data Malarkey. And if you don't know it, check out the 10,000 plus AI tools currently on there'sanaIforthat.com, an excellent resource. Les is qualified in his rapture for AI, and he sees a long, ongoing role for humans. And he makes an interesting comparison with improvisational comedic acting too.
what you put in there, which is what's called a prompt, right, is the thing that comes from you. In other words, if I put a good setup for a joke in there, or I put in something that's interesting, I did improv for about 5 or 6 years, and I was not good at it. I did it to try to get out of my head. But a prompt is really kind of like, where you go to the audience and you say, okay, give me something in your garage and tell me what kind of pirate I am. And then you have to make a scene out of it, right? And that's kind of what a prompt is. And that's what data is. Data is an observation recorded in the world of something at a certain point in time. And if you think about Jerry Seinfeld, that's what Seinfeld does. He observes stuff and he goes, you ever notice? And then he goes into what he noticed. And so there's actually a great, and I didn't take this from him, but he does a great thing called iQuant New York. And he takes data and he did improv and he turned it into things. And so I'm not sure if he's still around, but he has some videos on the web. But like, for instance, he figured out, he used data to figure out what's the one parking space that gets the most tickets in all of New York, right? So there's fun stuff with data like that I think makes the creative better. But, if you talk to data scientists, and I know a lot of them, and some of them are pretty funny, but some of them are not. A lot of them, because they have this wonderful logical kind of thing. So to be able to take that data and not just sort of do linear regression with it or project something out, but to make something funny out of it is really what creative people should do. And you can think about like from Birnbach, and I'm kind of going on here, but Birnbach's idea was let's, you had copywriters and you had art director people, and they'd go slide copy under the door to the art director. He'd draw it up. And Birnbach said, let's put these people in a room and make them hang out together and come up with stuff together. And that's a little bit of my relationship to ChatGPT, right? As I go, hey, I got this idea. And if I don't give it anything interesting to think about, it doesn't really come up with anything, kind of like my art director partner a lot of times, But like, for instance, a little while ago, I gave it the notion that I'm from Nashville, Tennessee. I said, okay, so write me an intro for a country song, the way country music artists go, there's a little song I wrote about, and then it kind of goes into this thing. Write that, but then write me a song about two robots in love. Now, ChatGPT wrote a really funny thing and a good country song and a great, funny country music intro to that. I'll tell you a little story about two robots, and this beautiful little story he wrote. But without me, it's not going to write that.
Shai Reichert, co-founder of digital marketing mavens XDS, based out of Philadelphia in the eastern United States, is of a similar mind to Les, making use of LLM-driven tools, but with caution.
Yeah, we use them to a degree. I mean, we use them as sort of content and thought accelerators, right? We'll go on ChatGPT. It's great for content strategy, for copy. We lean on it now, but I'm not saying anything that you don't already know, you've already heard. If you're a bad writer, ChatGPT is going to continue making you a bad writer, just at a greater volume. If you're a good writer, it's going to help you. So it's as much about what you put in as what you're getting out from those platforms. I'm not a believer in fads. Now but I'm not also someone who likes to stay behind. So I like to adapt, but I also am cautiously, right? I had a feeling that this whole metaverse was not going to go very far. Not that there's anything wrong with it per se. I just don't think we're there yet as a society. To me, it's like everything has to go to shit for us to just put on a VR headset after being in front of our computer all day. And guess what? We have a VR headset. My kids used it. I put it on once. It's just sitting there collecting dust right now, sadly, as I'm sure other people will attest. So to me, it's about, I like really digging through the fad to see what's there, what's real, what can be used. Where do we see ourselves in 10 years, right? Like, we're a digital agency. What does it mean in 10 years? Are we still going to be building websites? I hope so. Are we still going to be doing email marketing campaigns? I hope so. But you have to adapt, right? Same way as offline and print shops 25 years ago thought, yeah, we're going to be doing print material forever. And what's this new digital thing? Is this a fad, right? What are these websites? So it's being able to predict a little bit what's coming in some sense and align and position yourself. but also not trying to say, oh, look, we're just going to make everything. And our clients aren't asking for AI. Still clients have, websites that use like PowerPoint drawings on them, right? So people tend to try and sort of jump over things that are wrong with their digital properties or that they're not even doing to try and jump to the next thing. Let's get what you got going on organized and fixed right now. And, and then we can look at how we can enhance it with some new tech. I mean, there's an article I wrote on LinkedIn. I could dig it up for you about 6 things you should do with your websites for 2016. It's still relevant. And these people are talking about AI right now, right? I'm like, you don't even have a working contact form on your website.
And Angela Gallop can see the potential for AI taking the drudgery out of forensic science grunt work. Useful, but humans will still be needed to extract and articulate genuine forensic insights.
I'm quite sure it will be able to take the drudgery out of a lot of things. I think it will give them ideas which they might and create links which it might take them a lot longer to find by themselves. So I think there's lots of ways in which it can help. I think that you've always got to be careful. Well, but I think this may just reflect my knowledge of AI at the moment, but I think you've got to be careful that you don't rely on it too much, and you allow humans to develop their sort of imagination, and allow them to be able to suggest, well, I know we'd normally do that, but why don't we just do something really left field? But maybe, AI, I'm sure will be doing left field before very long, probably is already, but, I would hate us to miss something just because we've given it all to a machine to process. I want us to keep that, because it's sometimes those flashes of inspiration that you get, which lead you to being able to understand something better, or find something, or choose which particular bit of it to test, or whatever it might be. And at the moment anyway, I think we have to be careful about how we relinquish the job to AI. But I'm sure that it will be, on the whole, extremely helpful, just like it will be in so many other industries.
Using data smarter can be fraught with challenges. Ethics and inclusion expert Sabrina Shadie told me about how she uses data to overcome the often toxic, even poisonous challenges she and her team can face in the area of race and particularly white privilege.
I get a lot of pushback in terms of racism, a lot. And probably more so than, the homophobia, and more so than ableism, and more so than the sexism. And it's a really interesting one because it's such a conditioning, the fact that we can prove scientifically that race doesn't exist. It's completely constructed, and uses the metaphor for so many other things. You take that away from people and go, it doesn't exist in science. You can't differentiate between the people in that kind of way, that pseudoscience that was presented how many 100 years ago. It puts such an emotional backlash into the conversation. Because some people's identity is purely based on the fact that they can differentiate themselves as being superior to other people. And when you take that away, suddenly what are they? Who are they? What does this mean to them now? And I think that's very sad for that individual, but B, very challenging in terms of equality, diversity, inclusion, progression. You can't progress past this person's emotional reaction. So a lot of the work I do, I'm actually cognitive behavior therapist diploma back in my background. So we use cognitive behavior approaches to understanding why we have that emotional reaction and how we can think differently to overcome that emotional reaction to actually move towards a progressive state of affairs, rather than getting caught up in that really defensive, I don't have white privilege because I'm a poor white person. And you're like, now you're in your white kind of fragility conversation, and none of that is helpful. None of that is conducive to learning. None of that is, about community or moving forward. That's all about me and mine and protecting. So if we can move past that and talk about the ecosystem, talk about how you can use that privilege and open doors for other people, how you can leverage it to empower those around you, we can step away a little bit from, oh, this data hurts my feelings, to, oh, this data is insightful. How do I kick open the barn doors and make space for everybody here? And you turn everybody into that empowered ally, rather than a sort of hurt little child in the corner sulking because their favourite toy's just been torn apart or whatever.
Alexis Kingsbury is a serial entrepreneur and founder of Air Manual, a company which, according to his LinkedIn profile, sees him saving thousands of hours of time for business leaders each year, reducing stress and unlocking business growth. He brings how he makes smarter use of data to ensure that leaders and their teams track and take their holiday entitlement. A small issue on the surface, perhaps, but in reality symptomatic of much bigger underlying challenges.
In terms of the impact that we have with our clients, you're talking about things like business leaders who are working all hours, evenings, weekends, and feel unable to work on the business and instead stuck in it. They feel unable to spend decent amounts of time with their family members. They might be stressed. They might be unable to go on holiday, or at least unable to go on holiday without constant disruption. And in some cases, we have business owners who fundamentally have said to us that if we hadn't been involved, either they or their business wouldn't have survived, because they go through tough times, and they were already stressed. And without having reduced the stress and free up their time, then they wouldn't have been able to cope in those times. So that always it brings a bit of a lump to my throat, because that at its core, that's one of the things I love most about what we do, is to really help business leaders. And they might be the owner, it might be a COO, it might be a head of sales or whatever, who fundamentally feel so stressed and relied upon that they're not able to do the very basic things that we would encourage, never mind allow, of our employees. I was at a mastermind a few weeks ago where I asked the question, out of interest, how many business owners in this room full of business owners, track their own holiday, how many days holiday they take? And the answer is no. And not only, I think it was 1 out of a room of 40 people. And I think, and my hand was up because I do track mine. And it was almost met with a kind of it's even surprising to be asked that question. But the reason that they're not tracking it is because they know it's so low, right? It's like, and of course with employees, why do we track it? Well, either it's to make sure that they don't overtake, but often in my business particularly, it's to make sure that they're not undertaking holiday. We want to encourage them, making sure in our businesses we allow 40 days holiday. And so we want to encourage that. We want them to make sure that they're rested and so on, because we know that otherwise they can burn out and they can start to question, would I be happy at another company? I don't want them thinking about that. I want them taking the holiday. I want them to have 3 weeks off and not get disrupted. And so I love the fact that we make that transformation for people. But on the other side, there are businesses where it's less about getting them out of that kind of pain and more about removing the bottlenecks to growth. And so whether it's that you've got key people that the business is dependent on, and so it can't train up other people. So for example, for smaller businesses, you might have a business owner who does all the sales and they can't grow until they are able to train other salespeople up. Or in larger businesses, maybe it's a business where they're just having to firefight so many issues and mistakes that as a result, they're not able to focus on growth because they would just be scaling a problem. And so those are some of the sorts of things that we solve. Like in a nutshell, to some extent, it's scaling without stress. That's which we do a newsletter on at scalingwithoutstress.com for that reason, right? It's all about how do you do that. So that's kind of the lofty ambition, but something that we actually achieve. And I'll happily then go into how do we actually do that. But yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I mean, I'm sure I don't know if you'd phrase it in this way. I always think about the importance of life-work balance rather than work-life balance. I think putting work before work-life. It's it's like the French and Italians eating to live, living to eat, rather than the British eating to live. And I'm super impressed with your 40 days holiday. I think for your own, but I mean, clearly you've seen the benefits of this.
It's a while since I've heard a novel complaint about the impact of the EU's General Data Protection Regulation. But Sabrina Shadie identifies a particularly craven use of GDPR and appeals to its apparent restrictions as a smokescreen that organisations can use to avoid getting their diversity and inclusion house in order.
We see a lot of people not understanding GDPR. That's probably one of the big ones. So when it comes to equality, diversity and inclusion, lots and lots of organisations go, we can't do an equality, diversity and inclusion survey because GDPR. And it's like, I feel like you understand neither equality, diversity and inclusion requirements nor GDPR for you to be saying that to me. And I think it's the excuse around not having, we don't have this data, or we're not able to collect this data, or rather than going, we don't know enough to put this piece of work together, trying to use, those regulations as excuses to not do. Oh, our hands are tied, we can't do this thing because of GDPR. Oh, our hands are tied, we can't do this thing because of, data protection. It's like, none of that is true. And I can categorically, confirm none of that is true. We have an amazing GDPR specialist in our team who oversees all of the stuff that I put out before I send it, to make sure that our EDI surveys and stuff don't hit the triggers for GDPR data collection, which means you can go ahead and do it without having to worry, or if they do, it's managed within our policy set. But I've had lots of organisations say to me, after we've done the data surveys, we do them outside of the organisation, so we do them within our consultancy to take it away from the employer, so the employer doesn't have any responsibility for this data. We get a much better return by doing it that way because of the trust issues that may be in existence. And then the organisation tried to take the data off us and like, no, we want our data back. And it's like, it's not your data. It belongs to us because they're our employees. No, that's not how it works. The data belongs to them and they have an agreement with us. It's completely separate to our agreement with you. So yeah, I've had quite serious and very challenging conversations with CEOs and CFOs about no, it's our data. We want it back. You've got to give it to us. I'm like, I'll see you in court if you want, but no, that's not how data works. And I really suggest you maybe do a brush up course on GDPR, which I can offer you for a discounted price.
We'll end this roundup of the greatest hits of season 3 of Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter, with the intricate, eloquent tale I heard from Angela Gallop about how she and her team unpicked the cold case of the murder of Stephen Lawrence by a gang of racist thugs. The story speaks for itself.
Could you tell us briefly, if it's possible to do so briefly, about the evidence that you and your team found that led to the prosecution of Stephen Lawrence's killers? And as I understand it, that's evidence that was overlooked several times before you ever got to the case.
Yes, it's interesting that, we had learnt by the time that we started to reinvestigate the Stephen Lawrence case that one thing that was critical was to go back to the crime scene or get an idea of the crime scene as firmly as you could in your head, so you knew what the sequence of events was likely to be, because that helps very much in determining what you look for and what on and things. So we would have done that to begin with. And one of the things that we noticed in some of the witness statements was that people were suggesting that Stephen might have been struck, perhaps with an iron bar, before he was actually killed with the use of a knife. But it looked as though there might have been a bar might have been involved of some sort. And the police had recovered a piece of scaffolding pole from a nearby garden near the scene of the attack. And so we started, strangely, looking at that, discovered it had paint on it, as fairly brightly coloured paint, as you often find on scaffolding poles. And we thought, well, if that has been used and then just chucked away afterwards, we'll have a look for some of that paint on in Stephen's hair and on the upper part of his clothing, on his shoulders of his jackets and that sort of thing. And so we started with that, and we didn't find anything. But what we did notice was that there were quite a lot of red fibres on the surface of his clothing. And so we thought, that's interesting. Because basically at the beginning, everything's interesting because you don't know what you're doing. But then we had a look at the clothing he was wearing on the night in question. He was wearing about 6 layers of it because it was a cold night. And several layers down, he had a red polo shirt on, and so we looked at the red fibres, and sure enough, they matched. There were two different kinds, polyester and cotton, and they matched the constituents of this polo shirt. And while that wasn't interesting in itself, because obviously they'd come from his own clothing, what it did tell us was, well, here's something that we could look for. It's fairly easy to find because it's bright red, but we could look for on the clothing of the suspects, because the police had a number of suspects right from the very start, and we were, interested in them along with anybody else that the investigation might throw up. And almost immediately we started finding fibres that matched the constituents of polo shirt. And so we thought, well, that's interesting. Might just be coincidence, but it's interesting. Let's just think about what happened in relation to textile fibres. Let's now look at that. We'll forget about paint because we're not finding any paint. We'll home in on fibres. And one of the things that had happened is that the search for textile fibres had been fairly, it had been very extensive in one way, but really it had all been looking at fibres in one direction. Fibres that could have been left by the suspect's clothing on Stephen's clothing, because Stephen collapsed fairly quickly and nothing much happened to his clothing, whereas the suspects ran off and then goodness knows what they did, and what they did with their clothing and so on. And so the focus was all very much on that transfer of these tiny fibre fragments I've talked about in that direction. And so we thought, well, this is interesting. We're finding, that there are these red fibres available, red fibres transferring possibly to a couple of the suspects. Let's look for more fibres like Stephen's clothing on the suspect's clothing. And we started to find other things as well. And in the end, we found 4 different kinds of fibres that matched from different parts of his clothing. And the chances of getting exactly the same sort of fibre on someone else's clothing, it's sort of, it's pretty interesting, even if you only got one kind. But when you got 4 kinds, it's quite persuasive. And then in looking for more fibres, we thought, well, what else can we do with, what other samples can we sort of kind of create? I don't want to use the word create, but what other samples can we can find? And so we ended up brushing out the insides of the bags in which all of these items had been stored in. And that gave us some more textile fibres to look through. But critically, it gave us a tiny flake of blood. And of course, that's what we'd really been, interested in anyway, because, but rather like looking at fibres in only one direction, it had always been assumed, and I think we'd thought that this was probably the case, that because Stephen had just 2 cuts in his, just 2 stab cuts, and because he was wearing so many layers of clothing, and clothing is essentially self-cleaning so far as knives are concerned, as they're withdrawn through the clothing, then we thought, well, maybe we're not going to, we're not going to find any blood on any of the suspects, because, why would there be any left, and especially dripping off the end of the blade? Why would there be any of that? So we were slightly surprised to find this flake, but, very interested in it, obviously, and particularly because encased in it were 2 fibres of a 5th type that could have come from Stephen's clothing, from his cardigan. And so now we had 5 different sorts of fibres. So, very strong evidence in relation to textile fibres. And when we did DNA profiling on the blood in the flake, of course, it matched, well, I say of course, but it matched Stephen Lawrence's DNA. Then, of course, we had to find out where the flake might have come from. It wouldn't have landed as a flake in the bag. It must have come off the jacket that was in the bag. So we had a look all over the jacket. We'd already searched it. The Forensic Science Service scientists had searched it. We'd all had a look and hadn't found any blood because it was so tiny. And there was this tiny little stain left on the jacket in the back of the neck, which is actually is not an unlikely place to find it from an assault of this kind. And so we quickly DNA profiled that, and that gave us the same result. It matched Stephen's DNA. And so that was how the evidence emerged. At the same time, we had noticed on the clothing that there were lots of tiny little hair fragments, as if, people had haircuts. It's that kind of hair that we were finding, and we searched through those, and we found one, possibly two hairs, but one hair in particular, which we were able to test, which on one of the suspects' item of suspects' clothing, which could have come also from Stephen. We did a bit more DNA of a rather different kind, and got a result that matched his DNA with that. So in the end, we ended up with, quite a number of textile fibres. We ended up with some DNA evidence, and we ended up with some hair evidence as well. So from nothing, it was amazing. But we had to go on quite a journey to find it. And then, of course, we had to do an enormous amount of work at the end to make sure that it couldn't have got there through some sort of contamination, because these items had been examined by a number of different scientists in different locations over the years. And so we had to be really careful that couldn't explain it either. But so that was a big piece of work.
So there we have it. Season 3 is a wrap. So many different professions, so many different types of data, and so much to learn across the professions from the similarities in how my Call You Copier of guests makes smarter use of data. Joining the dots, moving from data to insight to action. We're taking a little winterval break for Christmas and the Roman feast of the Saturnalia, and also the New Year. But we'll be back in January with Season 4, and a fabulous season opening episode when I talk to Tracy Brown, the long-time director of Sense About Science, the charity that challenges misrepresentation of science and evidence in media and public discourse. Other guests next season come from the worlds of pharma, the military, supply chain logistics, football finance, and a truly exceptional exponent of data visualization. As ever, any suggestions for guests? If you think you'd make a good guest, or you work with someone who'd tell a great story about how they make smarter use of data, drop us an email at hello@usingdatasmarter.com or complete the application form at www.usingdatasmarter.com/guest, prefaced by https://. I look forward to welcoming you back for more data-driven common sense in the new year, with the Data Malarkey podcast dropping every other Wednesday on Apple, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, and video episodes going live a week later on our YouTube channel at Data Malarkey. Thank you so much for listening. Do like, subscribe, share, rate, with 5 stars, of course, on your favourite podcast platform. The first 3 seasons have been a blast, but we're only just getting started. And in the words of Raymond Briggs's Father Christmas, happy blooming Christmas.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.